Blood streaked down the stallion's flank as Cordelia Brightwater pressed her palm against the jagged wound, feeling the magnificent beast's heart hammering beneath her touch. The horse had collapsed just yards from her cabin door, its obsidian coat slick with sweat and crimson, wild eyes rolling white with pain and exhaustion. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her calloused fingers gentle despite the urgency. The gash was deep, made by barbed wire, or maybe a cougar's claws, and without immediate care, this beautiful creature would bleed out on her doorstep. She'd seen plenty of wounded animals in her 26 years living alone on the edge of whispering pines, but never one that looked like it had been crafted from midnight and starlight. This wasn't some broken-down ranch horse. This stallion was pure wildness, all muscle and fury and untamed spirit. As she worked to clean the wound with torn strips from her petticoat, movement caught her eye. A figure on horseback sat motionless at the tree line, watching. Too far to make out details, but close enough that she felt the weight of observation. The rider didn't approach, didn't call out, just watched as she tended to what was clearly a valuable animal. "Somebody's missing you, aren't they?" she murmured to the stallion, who had grown calmer under her ministrations. The horse's breathing steadied, and those intelligent dark eyes fixed on her face with something that looked almost like gratitude. The distant rider turned and melted. Back into the forest, Cordelia spent the next 3 days nursing the stallion. Back to health, bringing him water and grain, changing his bandages, talking to him in the low, soothing voice that had always worked magic on wounded creatures. He was stronger than she'd thought by the second day he was standing. By the third, he was pacing the makeshift corral she'd built from fallen logs. She knew she should let him go. Wild things belonged in the wild, and this horse was clearly meant to run free across the mountain meadows, not be penned up by a spinster woman who talked to herself and grew vegetables that barely kept her fed through the harsh winters. But when she opened the corral gate on the 4th morning, the stallion didn't bolt. Instead, he walked to her, lowered his great head, and nuzzled her shoulder with surprising gentleness. Then he turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving only hoofprints in the soft earth. That evening, his purple shadows stretched long across her small garden. Cordelia discovered something that made her heart skip, a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas, sitting precisely where the stallion had collapsed 4 days earlier. Inside was the most beautiful wedding dress she'd ever seen, white silk that seemed to glow in the fading light, with delicate pearl buttons and intricate lacework that must have taken months to complete. The dress was clearly expensive, more costly than anything she could ever afford, and it was exactly her size. There was no note, no explanation. Just the dress, perfect and pristine, as mysterious as the stallion who had led her to it. Cordelia held the wedding dress against herself, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. The silk whispered against her work-roughened hands, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine walking down an aisle, someone waiting for her at the altar with love shining in their eyes. The fantasy lasted exactly 10 seconds before reality crashed back. She was a mountain woman who lived alone, grew her own food, and had conversations with injured animals. Men in whispering pines barely acknowledged her existence when she rode into town for supplies. And those who did looked at her like she was some sort of curiosity, the strange woman who lived up in the hills. She was about to fold the dress away when hoofbeats thundered up to her cabin. "Miss Brightwater," a man's voice, urgent and breathless. She stepped onto her porch, still clutching the dress, and found herself face to face with Dorian Blackthorne, the new schoolteacher, who'd arrived in town just 2 months ago. He was younger than the typical frontier educator, maybe 30, with dark hair that always looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He sat astride a chestnut mare, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his white shirt torn at the sleeve, but it was his expression that caught her desperate, almost panicked. "I need your help," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "My horse threw me near Devil's Canyon, and I've been walking for hours. There's a wounded animal out there." "Beautiful black stallion." Someone said, "You have a way with injured creatures." Cordelia's grip tightened on the wedding dress. "Badly wounded?" "Bad." He's been caught in old trapping wire, and ... Dorian's eyes suddenly fixed on what she was holding, and his words died in his throat. Color drained from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "I found it. Right here, 4 days ago, after I helped." She stopped, studying his reaction. "You know something about this dress?" Dorian reached out as if to touch the silk, then pulled his hand back. "It belonged to my fiancée. Belonged to Evangeline." His voice cracked on the name. "She died of fever 3 weeks before our wedding. I've been carrying that dress with me ever since. Couldn't bear to leave it behind when I came west. But I found it here, on my porch." "That's impossible." "It was in my saddlebags when my horse bolted." His eyes widened. "Unless ... the black stallion." "You said you helped a black stallion." Understanding hit them both at the same moment. Cordelia sank onto her porch steps, the wedding dress pooling. Around her like moonlight, "He brought this to me." "But why?" Dorian sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, his hands clasped between his knees. "Evangeline always said animals were better judges of character than most people. She used to feed strays, nurse wounded birds back to health. She would have loved that you helped him. Now he's hurt again. Will you come with me? I know it's asking a lot, but I can't just leave him to suffer." Cordelia looked at the dress in her lap, then at the man beside her, this stranger who somehow felt familiar, whose grief echoed her own loneliness. "Let me get my supplies." As she gathered bandages and salve, she found herself stealing glances at Dorian through her cabin window. Stood beside his mare, staring off toward the mountains, and she could see the weight of sorrow in the set of his shoulders. When she emerged with her medical kit, he helped her mount her own horse, a gentle gray gelding named Pepper. His hands were warm and steady, and when their fingers accidentally brushed, she felt a spark that had nothing to do with static electricity. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know we barely know each other, but the stallion needs help." She interrupted, not trusting herself to analyze the fluttering in her chest. "That's what matters." They rode toward Devil's Canyon in comfortable silence, the wedding dress carefully wrapped in her saddlebags, connecting them to a love story that had ended before it could begin. The black stallion lay trapped in a tangle of old snare wire near the edge of Devil's Canyon, his struggles having only tightened the cruel metal around his legs. Blood matted his coat, and his breathing came in harsh, labored gasps. When he saw Cordelia approaching, he whinnied a sound so filled with recognition and hope that tears sprang to her eyes. "He remembers you," Dorian said in wonder. "Animals. Don't forget kindness." Cordelia dismounted and approached slowly, her hands visible, voice soft and reassuring. "Easy, beautiful, we're going to get you free." The process was painstaking and dangerous. The wire had cut deep, and every movement risked making the wounds worse. Dorian held the stallion's head, murmuring words of comfort while Cordelia worked with careful precision to untangle each strand. "How do you know so much about horses?" she asked, as she cleaned a particularly nasty gash. "My family bred them back. In Virginia, I was supposed to take over the business, but..." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the stallion's neck. "After Evangeline died, I couldn't stay. Everything there reminded me of the life we'd planned together. So you became a teacher. Seemed like a good way to disappear. New town, new identity. I thought if I could just get far enough away, maybe the pain would fade." Cordelia understood that impulse all too well. She'd been disappearing her whole life, first from the orphanage. That couldn't contain her wildness. Then from the judgment of townspeople who whispered about the strange girl who lived alone in the mountains. "Has it worked?" she asked quietly. "The disappearing?" Dorian was quiet for a long moment. "Until today, I thought it had. But seeing that dress, meeting you, maybe some things aren't meant to be forgotten." The stallion shifted restlessly, and they both focused on their work. As the last piece of wire came free, the magnificent horse struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg but clearly determined to stand. "He's going to need time to heal," Cordelia said, stepping back to assess the damage. "These wounds need daily attention. I could build a temporary corral behind the schoolhouse." The word came out more sharply than she'd intended. He needs quiet space, somewhere he can heal without people staring and speculating. Then what do you suggest? Cordelia looked at the stallion, who was watching her with those intelligent dark eyes, and made a decision that surprised her. He can recover at my place again. I don't want to impose you're not imposing, but I'll need help getting him there, and someone should check on his progress. She met Dorian's gaze directly. You're welcome to visit, to check on him. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of possibility. Dorian nodded slowly. I'd like that. They fashioned a makeshift travois from fallen branches in Dorian's coat, and together they coaxed the stallion on the slow journey to Cordelia's cabin. By the time they arrived, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they settled the horse in her corral. Now reinforced and expanded, Cordelia found herself acutely aware of Dorian's presence, the way he moved. With quiet confidence around the animals, the gentleness in his hands, the sound of his low voice as he spoke to the stallion. I should head back to town, he said finally. But I'll return tomorrow if that's all right. To check on him, of course. Walked him to where his mare waited patiently. Dorian, the dress due? You want it back? He considered this, looking toward her cabin where the wedding gown waited in her saddlebags. Evangeline would have wanted it to find its purpose. Maybe it belongs with you now. After he rode away, Cordelia stood in her dooryard for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the forest and the gentle movements of the healing stallion. When she finally went inside, she carefully hung the wedding dress in her wardrobe, next to her, to everyday dresses and her Sunday best. She didn't know why, but keeping it felt like holding on to hope. Dorian arrived the next afternoon with medical supplies from the town doctor and a basket of food from the hotel kitchen. Thought you might be hungry, he said with a shy smile that transformed his entire face. They worked together to change the stallion's bandages, and Cordelia found herself watching the careful way Dorian's hands moved, noting the patience he showed when the horse grew restless. This was a man who understood that healing took time. What made you want to teach? She asked as they sat on her porch afterward, sharing fresh bread and honey. Books saved my life when I was young. My father wanted me focused on breeding horses. Said education was a waste of time for someone who'd inherit a stable. But my mother smuggled me novels, poetry, histories of far-off places. He smiled at the memory. When she died, I promised I'd help other children discover that same magic. And Evangeline, did she share your love of books? She was the town librarian. We met when I came looking for a volume of Whitman poetry. Its expression grew distant. She had this way of knowing exactly which book someone needed, even if they didn't know it themselves. Cordelia felt a stab of something she refused to name jealousy. She sounds wonderful. She was, but she's gone, and somehow I'm still here. He looked at her directly. I'm beginning to think that might not be the tragedy I thought it was. Heat rose in Cordelia's cheeks, and she busied herself collecting their empty plates. I should check on the stallion. But when they approached the corral, they found it empty. The gate was still latched, the fence intact, yet the black horse had vanished as completely as morning mist. Fresh hoofprints led into the forest, but they stopped at the tree line as if the stallion had simply dissolved into the shadows. He was barely able to walk this morning, Cordelia said, bewildered. Maybe he's stronger than we thought. They searched until darkness fell, calling and listening for any sound that might indicate the stallion's presence. Nothing. It was as if the magnificent creature had never existed at all. This is my fault, Dorian said as they returned to the cabin. If I'd been more careful, hadn't let my horse bolt stop. Cordelia touched his arm, surprised by her own boldness. Wild things have their own wisdom. Maybe he knew something we didn't. That night, Dorian stayed for supper salt pork and beans and cornbread that tasted better than any meal he'd had since leaving Virginia. They talked about books and horses, about the loneliness of mountain winters and the peculiar characters who populated Whispering Pines. I should go, he said, when the fire burned low. People will talk if I stay out all night. Let them talk. The words slipped out before she could stop them, bold and reckless, and entirely unlike her usual careful self. Dorian stared at her. something igniting in those storm-gray eyes. Cordelia? She stood abruptly, suddenly terrified by the intensity of the moment. There's a spare blanket. You can sleep on the settee. He nodded, understanding her retreat. Thank you. She lay awake most of the night, listening to the sound of his breathing in the next room and trying to ignore the way her heart raced every time she heard him shift position. This was dangerous territory, caring for someone who might disappear. As suddenly as the mysterious Stallion, when morning came, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Dorian was standing at her stove, fully dressed, his hair damp from washing at her basin. Thought I'd make breakfast, he said without turning around. It's the least I can do. You don't need to, Cordelia. He faced her, and she saw something new in his expression, a kind of determined vulnerability. I know this is complicated. I know we barely know each other. But I haven't felt this alive since Evangeline died, and I think that means something. She could respond. Hoofbeats approached at a gallop. They both rushed to the window and saw a sight that made them gasp. The black stallion stood in her yard, but he wasn't alone. Beside him grazed a beautiful paint mare, her coat a patchwork of brown and white, and nursing at the mare's side was a foal so young it could barely stand coal-black like its father, with 4 white stockings that looked like it had stepped through fresh snow. A family, Dorian breathed. He brought his family as they watched. The stallion lifted his head and looked directly at the cabin, as if making sure they were witnessing this moment. Then he turned and led his little herd toward the meadow beyond Cordelia's garden, where wildflowers grew thick and sweet. He's telling us something, Cordelia whispered. That healing leads to new beginnings, Dorian said quietly. That love doesn't indict, it transforms. The horses remained in Cordelia's meadow for 3 days. And during that time, something fundamental shifted between her and Dorian. He rode out from town each morning and stayed until late evening, helping with her garden, repairing her fence, sharing meals that felt like glimpses of a different life entirely. On the 3rd evening, as they watched the mare graze peacefully, while her foal explored the world on unsteady legs, Dorian took Cordelia's hand. I have something to tell you, he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I won't be returning to town tonight. Her heart skipped. Why? Because Mayor Hutchins visited the school today? Apparently, several concerned citizens have reported that the new teacher has been spending an inappropriate amount of time with the hermit woman who lives in the hills. Cordelia tried to pull her hand away, but Dorian held fast. What did you tell him? They were absolutely right. His smile was fierce and joyful. I told him I intended to spend every moment I could with you, and if that was a problem, he could find himself a new teacher. Dorian, you can't just throw away your position because of what? Because I found someone who makes me want to build something real instead of just running away from grief. He turned to face her fully. Cordelia, I've been dead inside for 2 years. You brought me back to life. I'm not her, she said quietly. I'm not Evangeline. I can't be what she was to you. I don't want you to be her. I want you to be used, strong and independent, and brave enough to live alone on a mountain because it's what makes you happy. I want you to be the woman who saves wounded animals and talks to horses like they understand every word. And what do you want from me? Everything, he said simply. Your mornings and your evenings, your laughter and your silence. I want to plant gardens with you and read poetry aloud by the fire. I want to grow old watching you gentle wild creatures with your magic hands. Before she could respond, he stood and walked to his saddlebags, returning with a small wooden box. This was my grandmother's. Simple, nothing like what Evangeline had, but yes. Dorian blinked. Yes, I'll marry you. She laughed at his stunned expression. Did you think I was going to make you get down on one knee with a proper proposal? I was prepared to, he admitted, opening the box to reveal a plain gold band, set with a single small diamond. But I like your way better. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as perfectly as the wedding dress hanging in her wardrobe. As if everything had been leading to this moment, the wounded stallion. The mysterious gift, the way their lives had intersected at exactly the right time. That night, they lay side by side on blankets under the stars, talking about their future. In whispered voices, while the horse family grazed nearby. They would marry in the meadow, they decided, with only the pastor and maybe a few townspeople as witnesses. Cordelia would keep her cabin. It was perfect for the children they both hoped for, and Dorian would find work that didn't require him to please narrow-minded town councils. "I could start a horse breeding operation," he said. "This land is perfect for it. That stallion is your foundation, sire? In, if you'll have us as partners." As if summoned by their conversation, the black horse approached, moving with that fluid grace despite his recent injuries. He stopped just close enough to touch, and Cordelia slowly extended her hand. The stallion sniffed her fingers, then gently took the apple she'd been saving for him. "I think that's a yes," she whispered. When morning came, they woke to find the horse family had moved on. But they'd left something behind, hoofprints in the soft earth that formed a perfect circle around the spot where Cordelia and Dorian had slept. "A blessing," Dorian said, helping her to her feet. "Or a promise," Cordelia replied, looking toward the mountains where she knew the wild horses ran free, carrying their secrets and their magic to anyone brave enough to believe. The wedding dress fit Cordelia as if it had been made for her, the pearl buttons securing easily despite her nervous fingers. She stood before her grandmother's mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back radiant, hopeful, transformed by love into someone she'd never dreamed she could become. "You look beautiful," said Mercy Whitfield, the pastor's wife, who had arrived early to help with preparations. She was one of the few women in Whispering Pines who had never judged Cordelia's unconventional life. "That dress, ... it's extraordinary. Where did you find it?" "Found me," Cordelia said, smoothing the silk skirt. "I think it was always meant to be worn at this wedding, just not the one originally planned." They had decided on a simple ceremony. In the meadow where the Stallion's family had blessed their union, Pastor Whitfield would officiate, and they'd invited only a handful of townspeople, those who had shown them kindness rather than judgment. As Cordelia made her way outside, she gasped at what awaited her. The meadow had been transformed. Wildflowers had been woven into an archway where Dorian stood waiting, impossibly handsome in his best suit with a spray of mountain laurel pinned to his lapel. But it wasn't the human guests that took her breath away. Horses surrounded the meadow, dozens of them, watching from the tree line with pricked ears and alert eyes. Bays and chestnuts, paints and pintos, and at the center of them all, the magnificent black stallion with his paint mare and growing foal. "They came to witness," Pastor Whitfield said in wonder. "I've never seen anything like it." Dorian's face shone with joy as Cordelia approached, her simple bouquet of mountain flowers trembling in her hands. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered when she reached his side. The ceremony was brief, but perfect. They exchanged vows. They had written themselves promises to tend each other's wounds, to run wild together, to build something lasting from the ashes of their separate sorrows. When Pastor Whitfield pronounced them married and Dorian kissed his bride, the stallion lifted his head and called out a trumpet of celebration that was answered by every horse in the meadow. The reception was held on Cordelia's porch. Food contributed by the few wedding guests, and music provided by old Jedediah Morse's fiddle. As evening approached and the guests prepared to leave, the newlyweds found themselves alone except for the horses, who continued their vigil at the meadow's edge. "Do you think they'll stay?" Cordelia asked, leaning against her husband's chest as they swayed to music only they could hear. "Some will, some won't, but they'll always return." Dorian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "This is sacred ground now." That night, in the cabin that was now their home, they made love with a tenderness that spoke of healing and hope. Afterward, as Cordelia drifted toward sleep in Dorian's arms, she thought she heard hoofbeats circling the cabana, protective blessing from the wild horses who had brought them together. When morning came, most of the horse herd had dispersed, but the black stallion remained with his family. As Dorian and Cordelia shared breakfast on their porch, the magnificent creature approached with something in his mouth. He dropped it at their feet and stepped back, a braided horsehair rope, intricately woven from strands of black and white and brown. "A wedding gift," Cordelia breathed, picking up the rope and marveling at its craftsmanship. "Or a partnership offer," Dorian said. Maybe he's ready to work with us after all. Over the following weeks, as spring turned to early summer, new life took shape. Dorian built a proper stable and began training young horses with methods that emphasized trust over dominance. The black stallion, whom they'd named Midnight Promise, became their foundation's sire, though he remained free to come and go as he pleased. Word spread about the couple, who worked magic with horses. And soon people were traveling from distant towns to buy horses trained with the Blackthorn method. Their business thrived, and so did their love. 2 years later, Cordelia stood in the same meadow where she'd been married, watching her husband work with a spirited young Mustang. Her hands rested on her rounded belly, where their first child grew strong and restless, already showing signs of the wildness that ran in both their bloodlines. The horse training business had exceeded all their expectations. People came from as far as Denver and San Francisco to buy horses trained with their gentle methods. And several wealthy ranchers had commissioned breeding programs using Midnight Promise's bloodline. But it was the unexpected visitors that brought Cordelia the most joy. "Mama, look." Their adopted daughter Luna came running across the meadow, her dark braids flying. They had found the 8-year-old girl wandering alone near Devil's Canyon the previous winter, half frozen and clearly fleeing something terrible. She'd never spoken of her past, but she had an extraordinary gift with animals that rivaled even Cordelia's abilities. "What is it, little bird? The black mare had her baby." Luna's eyes shone with excitement. "And it's got blue eyes, just like the stories say." Indeed, Midnight Promise's latest offspring was extraordinary, a filly with her father's midnight coat, but the rare blue eyes that marked her as something special. In the old traditions Luna had shared with them, blue-eyed horses were considered messengers between worlds. "She needs a name," Dorian said, joining them with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair tousled from working. Even after 2 years, Cordelia's heart still fluttered when he smiled at her like that. "Evangeline," Luna said without hesitation. She should be named Evangeline. Cordelia and Dorian exchanged a look of surprise. Their daughter rarely made such definitive pronouncements, and she'd never heard them speak of Dorian's first love. "Why that name?" Dorian asked gently. "Because she told me to," Luna said matter-of-factly. "The lady in the white dress. She said the blue-eyed filly should carry her name forward, and that way she'd never really be gone." Cordelia felt tears spring to her eyes as understanding dawned. "You saw her? The lady in white? She comes sometimes. When the horses need blessing, she always smiles at you and Papa, and she says thank you." Luna tilted her head, studying their expressions with the unsettling wisdom of children who've seen too much. "She's not sad anymore. She says love doesn't end, just finds new ways to grow." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Cordelia leaned into her husband's embrace and reflected on the strange turns their lives had taken. "Do you think it's possible," she asked, quietly, "that she somehow orchestrated all of this? The stallion finding me, the wedding dress appearing when it did." "I think love is more powerful than we understand," Dorian replied, his hand gently stroking her swollen belly. "Maybe souls who love deeply enough leave echoes behind, helping guide others toward happiness." A soft whinny drew their attention. To the meadow, where the new filly Evangeline stood on impossibly long legs beside her mother. As they watched, Midnight Promise approached his newest daughter, touching her gently with his muzzle in a gesture of welcome. "A new beginning," Cordelia whispered. "The best kind," Dorian agreed, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The wild horses emerged from the forest for their evening ritual of peaceful gathering in the meadow that had become sacred to them all. Midnight Promise led his expanded herd to the stream for water. While other wild horses grazed peacefully nearby, Luna fell asleep between her parents, lulled by the gentle sounds of horses and home. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere, deeper in the forest, a wolf howled, wild voices singing the ancient songs of the mountain. Cordelia closed her eyes and smiled, feeling the baby stir restlessly beneath her heart, already eager to join this magical world where wounded hearts could heal, where love transcended death, and where wild horses still blessed those brave enough to believe in miracles. Their love story had begun with a wounded stallion, and a mysterious wedding dress. But it would continue through generations, and the horses they bred, the children they raised, and the legend of the couple who proved that some bonds are strong enough to bridge any distance, even that between life and death. In the meadow, the horses settled for the night, and peace descended over the little cabin where three hearts beat in harmony with the eternal rhythm of the wild.